Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Thanks for tuning in to Westferry Times. We really appreciate you watching. Today, we're diving deep into, well, a really major global issue: the sanctions imposed on Russia after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. We've pulled together quite a range of sources to really get under the skin of this, what's working, what maybe hasn't, and what the bigger picture looks like. Our mission today really is to give you a clear understanding of how effective these measures have been, some of the surprising twists and turns we've seen, and maybe where things are headed next.
It's certainly a fascinating and very complex situation. We want to give you the essential insights without getting totally lost in all the technical weeds. Think of it as maybe your shortcut to understanding one of the most significant geopolitical events of our time.
Absolutely. And to help us navigate this intricate landscape, we're delighted to welcome Dr. James Thornton. Dr. Thornton is a senior fellow at the Westferry Institute for Global Affairs and an expert in international relations and economic policy. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Okay, Dr. Thornton, let's maybe just get right into it. Immediately following the 2022 invasion, we saw this wave of sanctions coming from Western nations, the EU, the UK, the US. Can you sort of paint a picture for us? What were those initial sanctions really targeting?
Certainly. The initial measures were really designed to hit the core of Russia's ability to wage war and, importantly, finance its operations. So this meant focusing hard on the financial sector, limiting their access to international banking systems. Think of it like cutting off major credit cards on a national scale. They also targeted the energy sector, aiming to reduce the flow of, those petrodollars that are just so vital to Russia's economy.
Hmm.
And of course, the defense industry, trying to choke off their supply of advanced technologies and key components.
Right, so hitting them where it hurts, essentially. Finance, energy, defense. And these weren't static measures, were they? I mean, we've seen them change and adapt over time. What's really been the driving force behind that evolution?
Exactly. That's a key point. As Russia inevitably looked for ways around these initial barriers, the countries imposing sanctions had to respond. They had to tighten the rules, plug the emerging holes. It's a constant process. And a key area where we've really seen this sort of cat and mouse game play out is with the emergence of what's now known as the shadow fleet.
The Shadow Fleet. Okay, that sounds intriguing, almost cinematic. Can you tell us more about what that actually is?
Well, think of it as a kind of clandestine armada, really. Mostly older ships, aging tankers.
Yeah.
Russia's using them to move oil and other restricted goods, basically under the radar of Western sanctions. These vessels often fly flags of convenience, meaning they're registered in countries with, shall we say, less stringent oversight. And they're frequently linked to shell companies that are deliberately opaque, very hard to penetrate.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's like trying to track a ghost ship, very, very difficult to pinpoint who owns them, who's operating them, and crucially, what they're carrying.
Right. So this Shadow Fleet, it's basically become a major loophole that Russia has been exploiting to keep its oil flowing.
Precisely. A
Yeah.
significant workaround. And recognizing the scale of this evasion, both the EU and the UK have recently introduced specific sanctions directly targeting this fleet. They're trying to shut down this critical avenue, but it really highlights a key vulnerability in international sanctions, just how difficult it is to effectively police global shipping networks, and frankly, the ingenuity of those seeking to circumvent restrictions.
Okay, so despite those efforts to close loopholes, the sanctions have been in place for a while now. Let's talk about the real-world impact. What kind of economic dent have these measures actually made in Russia? Have they felt it?
Oh, the impact has definitely been significant, yes.
Yeah.
To give you a concrete example, Russia's oil revenues, which are, a massive part of their national income, they plummeted. We saw a drop of over 40% in early 2023 compared to the year before.
40%. Wow.
Yes, and this drop reflects both reduced sales to their traditional Western markets and also the price caps that were imposed on Russian oil. Additionally, just looking at the UK, for instance, they've frozen a substantial amount, 25 billion worth of Russian assets.
25 billion pounds.
That's a huge amount of financial power that's effectively been taken out of play, frozen.
Those are some really telling figures. But, we also hear that the Russian economy has shown some surprising resilience, that it's been adapting to these pressures.
Yeah.
How do we sort of reconcile those two things, the big hit, but also the resilience?
That's a crucial point, and it's true. Russia has indeed shown adaptability. One key strategy has been a really significant reorientation of its trade, primarily towards Asia. China and India in particular have become major buyers of Russian oil, offering a vital alternative market now that Europe has largely turned away.
So new customers, essentially.
It's exactly. However, it's really important to understand that this pivot doesn't fully compensate for the losses from Western sanctions. Not by a long shot. Often, these new deals come with significant price discounts for the buyers.
Yeah.
Russia doesn't have the same leverage, and the infrastructure needed to fully redirect massive energy flows, well, that takes time and huge investment. So while Russia has found alternative markets, this increased dependence on just a few large buyers creates new economic vulnerabilities for them, and it limits their negotiating power down the line.
Right, so they've found new customers, but perhaps not on the same terms or scale as before. Okay, now let's maybe zoom out a little and look at the bigger picture here. Sanctions rarely exist in a vacuum, do they? What kind of wider global effects, these sort of ripple effects, have we seen stemming from these measures against Russia?
Oh, we've definitely seen significant shift, particularly in global energy markets. That's probably the most obvious one. As Europe has deliberately and quite rapidly moved away from Russian energy, gas, and oil, this has inevitably increased demand elsewhere. And in some cases, it's pushed prices higher in other parts of the world. It's like a major reshuffling of the deck in the global energy sector.
A reshuffling, yeah.
And we've also observed a growing discussion, maybe even a slight acceleration, around de-dollarization. Countries like China and Russia are increasingly exploring and actually using alternative currencies for trade. Yuan, rubles, rupees. You can think of it as countries trying to have more options than just the US dollar in the global financial system.
To reduce reliance.
Partly, yes, potentially to reduce their reliance on the US dollar and therefore their vulnerability to US-led financial sanctions in the future.
Interesting. And what about the impact on, say, developing countries? How have they been caught up in this global ripple effect?
Well, developing nations have faced a whole range of challenges, unfortunately. The increasing global food and energy prices, which has been partly driven by disruptions to supply chains and trade flows related to the conflict and the sanctions,
Yeah.
well, that's hit them particularly hard.
Food and energy prices, yeah.
Remember, Russia is a major exporter of key agricultural commodities. Things like fertilizers and grains are crucial. Now, while the sanctions don't usually directly target food exports, they can indirectly affect their availability and affordability. Think about logistical challenges, shipping insurance, financial restrictions on Russian entities. It all adds up. And this raises really serious concerns about food security in regions that were already vulnerable.
That's a really critical point. Okay, this naturally leads us to consider the political dimension then. How have these economic sanctions actually influenced Russia's decision-making, both, within its own borders and in its foreign policy?
Domestically, there's no doubt the economic pressures, inflation eating into people's savings, the weakening of the ruble we saw, have created strains, real strains. The Kremlin has been forced to significantly increase military spending to sustain its war efforts in Ukraine. And this likely comes at the expense of other areas, potentially cutting back on social programs or infrastructure investment.
So internal trade-offs.
Internal trade-offs, exactly. Internationally, we've certainly seen Russia actively working to strengthen its ties with non-Western countries, particularly China, trying to build this narrative of a multipolar world, presenting itself as a counterweight to what it perceives as Western dominance and the sanctions regime.
Right, strengthening those alternative alliances. And the crucial question, I suppose the one everyone asks, have these sanctions actually changed Russia's calculus when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine itself? Has it shifted their stance?
Well, at this point, the evidence suggests that the sanctions haven't led to a fundamental shift in Russia's core strategic goals regarding Ukraine. The current analysis generally indicates that the Kremlin's approach might be more about trying to weather the economic storm, to essentially wait it out, perhaps hoping for a weakening of Western resolve over time.
But waiting for the West to blink, perhaps.
Possibly. Or anticipating political changes within the key sanctioning countries' elections, shifts in priorities that could potentially lead to a softening or maybe even a gradual reversal of some of these measures.
Okay, so if the current situation isn't achieving that specific desired outcome of changing their stance on Ukraine, what might the future hold? What steps could the international community, the countries imposing sanctions, consider to make these measures more effective in the long term?
Well, enhancing the effectiveness really requires, I think, a multifaceted strategy. It's not just one thing. Firstly, there needs to be a continued and probably intensified effort to close the loopholes that allow Russia to evade sanctions. That means a particular focus on dismantling the operations of that shadow fleet we discussed earlier. That's critical.
Tackling the shadow fleet, yeah.
Secondly, greater international cooperation is absolutely essential, particularly engaging with non-Western countries. The goal there is to prevent the undermining of the sanctions regime through alternative financial channels and trade networks that bypass the West.
Getting more countries on board, or at least not actively helping evasion.
Exactly. And finally, maintaining a unified front among the sanctioning countries themselves is vital. And part of that is clearly articulating the conditions under which sanctions could potentially be eased or lifted. That clarity is important to sustain pressure on Russia and signal a long-term unified commitment.
A unified front and clear objectives. That makes sense. Dr. Thornton, this has been incredibly insightful. You provided such a valuable and really clear perspective on what is undeniably a complex and evolving issue. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure entirely. It's, as you say, a constantly evolving situation, and hopefully this discussion has provided some clarity for your listeners.
It certainly has for me, and I'm sure for our audience too, and for you listening. We really hope this deep dive has shed some useful light on the intricate web of sanctions against Russia, their very far-reaching impacts, both intended and unintended, and the ongoing challenges in making them truly effective. Here's maybe a final thought for you to consider, something to mull over. In the long game of international relations, what is the true power, but also what are the limitations of economic pressure when used as a tool of foreign policy? And perhaps more complexly, how do we, as a global community, weigh the intended strategic goals against those unintended consequences that inevitably ripple across the globe, affecting so many? Lots to think about there. Thanks again for joining us for this deep dive on Westferry Times. Goodbye for now.